Ontario Premier Doug Ford today unveiled his new cabinet with several new faces to the cabinet, as well as some demotions to the cabinet. Here's a look at some of those key changes in Ontario's new cabinet. It was a big day out front of Queen's Park today, where the Lieutenant Governor of the province of Ontario swore in the government's new cabinet. On June 2nd, Doug Ford's Progressive Conservatives were elected to another majority government. Doug Ford has selected his new cabinet and they were sworn in by the Lieutenant Governor today. Several rookie MPPs are going straight into cabinet. Some returning ministers are getting new portfolios and some are staying put where they are. Long-term care minister Paul Calandra, finance minister Peter Bethlenfalvy, transportation minister Caroline Mulrooney, and education minister Stephen Lecce all remained in their portfolios. Health minister Christine Elliott was replaced. This follows her announcing earlier this year that she would not seek re-election as MPP for her home riding of Newmarket Aurora. Premier Doug Ford said a few days before unveiling his new cabinet that he consulted with Elliott about a potential replacement for her.
Consulted with Christine. That's the most important person because she held that role for 4 years, and I'm taking her advice.
Elliott was replaced by former Solicitor General Sylvia Jones, who was sworn in today.
I ask Mr. Jones to please come forward.
Jones will now become the province's new Deputy Premier and Minister of Health.
I, Sylvia Jones, swear that I will duly and faithfully and to the best of my skill and knowledge execute the powers and trusts reposed in me as Deputy Premier and Minister of Health in the province of Ontario. So help me God.
Noticeably not in cabinet today was former Tourism Minister Lisa MacLeod, who came under fire for her previous post as Minister of Children, Community and Social Services over her handling of the autism file. After not receiving a cabinet post today, MacLeod did release a statement. It reads in part, "Under advice and guidance from my physician and medical support team, I have been advised to take some time off to address and improve my health. I owe it to myself, my husband, Joe, and my daughter, Victoria, to take that advice." MacLeod was re-elected on June 2nd's provincial election date to her Ottawa riding of Nepean. She will stay on as Nepean's MPP despite not getting a role in cabinet, but she says she'll take the summer to focus on healing and on her health. Also demoted from cabinet is Sault Ste. Marie MPP Ross Romano. The reason for his demotion out of cabinet is unknown. However, Northern Ontario will still have representation from its plenty of other cabinet ministers who were sworn in today. It's expected the legislature will sit over the summer months. Therefore, the new cabinet ministers will have time to learn their new portfolios. Coming up today on the program, reaction to that new cabinet. First, I'll speak to the Queen's Park Observer's Sabrina Nanji. Then I'll speak to Scott Reid and Kim Wright, two commentators who will provide their perspectives. Then I'll speak to Progressive Conservative strategist Michael Diamond. And lastly, I'll speak to Steve Paikin, anchor and host of The Agenda with Steve Paikin. That is all coming up on this special Ontario Cabinet edition of the Wyatt Sharp Show. With me now is Sabrina Nanji from the Queen's Park Observer. Sabrina, thanks so much for joining us. Let's start out with some of the ministers who kept their portfolios today, because obviously some of the higher profile ministers, all of them kept their portfolios. Transportation Minister Caroline Mulrooney stayed, Finance Minister Peter Bethlenfalvy, and Education Minister Stephen Lecce. What does that signalize as to the way that the government wants to move forward in its next 4 years?
Yeah, well, you kind of hit the nail on the head there. The biggest files, I guess, besides health, which we can maybe dig into a little bit more, it's kind of the same faces that we've seen over the last couple of years with the Ford government. And I think that speaks to, the Ford government wanting to not maybe rock the boat a little bit. You mentioned Bethlenfalvy, Mulrooney, a lot of big promises on transportation in particular. So she's got her work cut out for her. And then there's, of course, course, Stephen Lecce, who also has his work cut out for him. You know, we're right ahead of teacher bargaining. That's ramping up right now. I don't know if education unions are so happy with Lecce at the helm of that file so much, but I think that, you know, the Ford government isn't wanting to rock the boat very, very much right now. They did have a lot more MPPs to choose from with 83 seats. So I think, you know, some of that was maybe a bit surprising. Not a huge new cabinet with 30 people, you know, over the 28 that were there previously. But there's definitely some new faces. But, you know, for the most part, it was not a huge cabinet shuffle today.
And you mentioned health, and I do want to go there in a second, but just first to talk about Michael Ford, Doug Ford's nephew, who was appointed as the Minister of Citizenship and Multiculturalism in the province. There's been a lot of critics who have kind of went after that decision to put Michael Ford in cabinet so soon after being elected, considering he's not an incumbent MPP. Do you think it is, I guess you could say, a good look on the Premier, and what do you think it says again about the way that the government will move forward?
I mean, certainly it's not the greatest optics, right? Michael Ford is a young person, and it's not to say that young people aren't doing great things in politics. He does have, quite a few years under his belt being a Toronto City Councillor. But there were a lot of questions, and it's, as we say, bad optics in politics. You know, certainly the opposition parties kind of pounced on that one a little bit. The NDP wasn't so happy. But maybe just a bit of gossip for your audience here is that I was actually speaking to one Tory insider who kind of spun it, and their spin on this is that they wanted someone with a Ford name in the multiculturalism file because they're doing a lot of outreach to so-called ethnic communities, and so having someone from with the Ford name in that portfolio might signal to those communities, you're very important to us. But then there's other critics that I'm talking to that are saying, that's just spin, and we really would have liked to see a more diverse cabinet, and maybe even someone on that file in particular. So, a lot of eyes are going to be on Mikey Ford here, and there might be some tough questions for him, but it's not a huge file. Multiculturalism, it's not like transportation or infrastructure or finance or education or health. And so I think he might be able to lay low for the next couple of years.
Okay, Sabrina Nanji from the Queen's Park Observer. Sabrina, thanks as always for your time, and thanks for providing some of your perspective on the new cabinet today.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, Wyatt.
Joining me now for their reaction to today's cabinet swearing-in ceremony is Liberal commentator Scott Reid and NDP commentator Kim Wright. Thanks to the both of you for joining me. Kim, I want to start out with you because you were at Queen's Park today and you watched the swearing-in ceremony. What are some of the key takeaways that you took from today's swearing-in ceremony, specifically noting that some of the highest profile cabinet ministers like Education Minister Stephen Lecce, the Minister of Finance Peter Bethlen-Falvey, and Transportation Minister Caroline Mulrooney, all three of the biggest ministers, seem to have kept their portfolios. What does that to you signalize as to which direction the government will be headed?
Yeah, the Premier is looking for a steady as she goes type of cabinet of people he can engage with, that he has engaged with. They've forged a bit of a trial by fire over the last couple of years during the pandemic. I don't think he's looking for big swings in personality. And so that's really where we look to. Minister Lecce has already gone through a round of teacher negotiations and then won re-election on it. So being able to jump right back into that. The labor portfolio and the expansion of that into labor, immigration, training, and skills development really does fit within the ethos of the Premier, and as well will work with Minister McNaughton's skill set. So I think it's a really interesting reshift. He's going to have to answer internally for an expanded cabinet, but also with 83 mouths to feed in the political sense. It's going to be a challenge of caucus management, and we started to see some of that today.
And just before I go to Scott, just to follow up with you on the Monty McNaughton piece that you mentioned, he's been often viewed from even people across the aisle as an effective communicator. So I guess, do you think the Premier made a right move giving him that extra immigration title today? And how does that, I guess, relate to his other title that he holds of labor training and development?
Yeah, Minister McNaughton really righted the ship, so to speak, on the labor portfolio. At the start of the last term, the premier and his cabinet at the time went in and ripped up a bunch of labor agreements that the Carpenters Union and others in the labor movement had with municipalities. There was a really big reshift. So when Minister McNaughton came in, it was, okay, we've heard you. We went too hard, we went too fast, and we didn't go to our core values. And Minister McNaughton has done two things. One, really reaching out, especially to building trades and the breadth of building trades. But he's also brought his young daughter Annie into his social media feed, showcasing women in trades. And regardless of politics, regardless of political stripes, the more we can get women in the trades and normalize that as a career path, I think is terrific. And weaving this new tapestry of labor will be interesting if we're going to get to the ring of fire, if we're going to manage gig economy. Now, there's a lot of ifs, Wyatt, and cabinet days and inaugurations for our US followers. Always sounds really pretty and really great and really rah-rah. It really does become the what do you do with that and what are your actions?
Scott, what's your general reaction to the cabinet swearing in today? Specifically, I guess touch on some of the people who were ousted from cabinet or some of the demotions that were a part. Obviously, Lisa MacLeod being removed from cabinet today, going into today, was sort of expected from party insiders, at least that I spoke with. But I guess what does that mean in terms of how the government moves forward, not having one of the cabinet ministers that's really been there with them since the beginning in Lisa MacLeod?
I actually think if you look at the people that were dropped and you look at the wide number of people that retained in the same portfolios, it tells the same story. It's a governed by gut Doug Ford government, right? That's how he likes to play it. It's about personal relationships. People always underestimate this. They always talk about, oh, we got to think about geography, got to think about diversity, got to think about balance, all these kinds of issues. But the sort of unrecognized element of cabinet making almost always is chemistry with the premier, chemistry with the center, right? Cabinet office, premier's office. And I think if you want an explanation as to why so many ministers retain their portfolios as is, and at the same time ask why did some people get demoted, particularly Lisa MacLeod, it's all gut, it's all relationship, it's all about the relationship that's been struck with the center. Doug Ford felt comfortable with all those people, didn't want to move them. I like them where they are. I like it way it works. I don't want to change it. We just got reelected with more members. Why would I fix what ain't broken? And Lisa MacLeod, well, she was a problem. He felt she was a problem. The only time he ever heard from her or heard about her, it was causing him a headache. Not what Doug Ford wants. So I'm not surprised by that. And it's all this, I'm going to govern by gut. I'm going to govern by feel. I'm going to lead by sense of smell. That's who Doug Ford is. It's worked for him. And it's kind of hard to quarrel with it.
And just on that piece, Scott, I mean, Lisa MacLeod, often people who have been speculating as to why she was removed, obviously people have said what you just went over, but also a lot of people are talking about how in the most recent election, the Ontario NDP revealed that she took salary top-ups from her riding association, as did many other progressive conservative MPPs. But one of them who did was sworn into cabinet again today. So does it, like, can people really read into the salary top-ups from her riding association as to a reason why she was removed from cabinet, again, considering there was an MPP who took a salary top-up that was sworn in again to cabinet today?
Well, I think you obviously can't overestimate its importance, because if that was a critical factor, then we would have seen an across-the-board policy, and we didn't. We saw an arbitrary application. I don't think it's a strike against her, but my guess is it's got a lot more to do with the way that she managed stakeholders, the way that she managed internally with staff. Like, you take a look at why Sylvia Jones, the health minister, why did she move from Solicitor General to health minister when he was looking to replace somebody so central to his government as Christine Elliott? Why did he turn to Sylvia Jones? Well, in her portfolio during the pandemic, she had to work with the center, hand in glove, managing enforcement issues around pandemic and lockdown. They worked with her. They found her easy to work with, decent to work with, convivial. I think they found all the opposite things with Lisa MacLeod. It's my guess. And, again, I just go back to it. Doug Ford is a people person. How am I getting along with people? How am I not getting along with people? And so I don't think it has as much to do with the riding top up as it has to do with, sorry, you're causing me grief and I don't like grief.
And Kim, Lisa McLeod, on that point again, she in her portfolio that she held up until today of tourism didn't face as much scrutiny as her previous post of children, community, and social services. What ultimately do you think pushed the premier to oust her from cabinet, and to what extent do you agree, or what would you add on to what Scott said?
Yeah, I mean, some of her comments when she had the autism file in particular, give them an iPad, never sat well with the autism community. And they've had now a couple of different ministers trying to rebalance that relationship. And frankly, the only people in the lawn of Queen's Park today protesting, because you kind of expected more, was the autism community saying 50K is too many. And that's the waiting list that has grown exponentially. And frankly, going into 2018, the Conservatives actually had a decent plan to how to manage the autism file in a meaningful way. And they scrapped that as their almost a first act of defiance. Then you move forward, even when Lisa McLeod got moved in that first cabinet shuffle over to tourism, she went to a concert and started, finger wagging to Eugene Melnick, the head of the Ottawa Senators at the time, and then, I'm your minister, don't you know who I am? I mean, none of that sits well. To Scott's point, when what you're hearing is a headache, he did not need that. We also saw the other demotion we saw and booting out of cabinet was Ross Romano. Same problem. Every time he was hearing about then Minister Romano, and even during the campaign about, was he offloading his parking passes in downtown Toronto for, all of these types of things. It's just a headache that you didn't need. And with 83 seats, you don't have to hang on to the headaches. And so that's really what we saw today.
And Scott, just lastly to you, Doug Ford's nephew, Michael Ford, was sworn into cabinet today as well. How does he prove that he's there because he's, going to be an effective minister, and not because, say, he's Doug Ford's nephew?
Oh, he has to perform. He has to show. He has to provide results. And, I think he's been given a portfolio where he's not going to be pressed too hard. He doesn't have to, catch all the hot potatoes. But, I think some of the immediate reaction is a bit unfair. It's just the most cliched and obvious thing to say, the only reason he's there is that he's his nephew and they're obsessed with creating Ford Nation, sustaining Ford Nation, being a political dynasty. Maybe all that's true, but let's judge a guy on his merits. And so far, there's no merits to judge. So let's see how he does in the job. If he does well, then fine. I can tell you the line between ministers in a provincial government who do well and ministers that don't do well is pretty darn thin. Most of them don't get noticed. You're not in healthcare or education. Who's really paying that close of attention? So give the guy his time, give him his due, see how he does, and then judge him.
Wyatt, I just want to jump on this because I've known Mike Ford for years. And I'll say this, any other MPP coming in that was a school board trustee and a re-elected city councillor would have been absolutely front of the line for a cabinet portfolio. But for the fact he is the nephew of, people are finger wagging and wringing their hands and want to make a thing. He is incredibly good on his feet. He's really good at coalition building. And oddly enough, on some files, him and now new MPP Kristen Wong-Tam did a whole bunch of things at Toronto City Hall that were a bit unexpected. So I think people underestimate the passion and compassion that Mike Ford has. And I'll tell you this, he wants to understand how a place works. And I wouldn't underestimate him.
Okay, Liberal commentator Scott Reid and NDP commentator Kim Wright, thanks as always to the both of you for providing your perspectives today on the new cabinet. Thanks to you both. Joining me now for the Conservatives' perspective on today's cabinet swearing-in ceremony is Progressive Conservative strategist Michael Diamond. Michael Diamond, thanks so much for making the time. Let's start out with some of the key appointments of the swearing-in ceremony today, specifically some of the new cabinet ministers. What do you make of people like Michael Ford, Doug Ford's nephew, getting a cabinet post? There was some critics today who were saying that, Michael Ford will have to prove himself that he can actually govern in that role. So again, just what do you make of that?
Look, I think it's easy to criticize from the sidelines, but when you look at it, Michael Ford has a tremendous amount of political experience. He's a person who's been twice elected to Toronto City Council. He was once elected to the Toronto District School Board. He won a seat for the Progressive Conservative Party that has not been won in any time that I can remember for the party. So I mean, that I think right away makes him an absolute star candidate. And I think that the riding he represents is quite diverse. The ward he represented on city council was quite diverse. I think Michael Ford's actually an ideal person to lead this citizenship and multiculturalism portfolio because of where he represents, who he's worked with, and who he is as a person.
What do you think it signalizes in terms of the direction that the Ontario government wants to move forward, and considering it's all of the like high profile ministers like Stephen Lecce in education, Peter Bethlenfalvy in finance, Caroline Mulroney in transportation, et cetera, all of them have kept their portfolios. So again, what does that signalize as to how the government's going to move forward?
Oh, certainly. If you look at the large portfolios, there was a lot of continuity, steady as she goes, you could say, and I think that's a good sign. This is a government that was reelected based on its track record, and it ran on its track record. So that you had, Doug Ford likes to call all of his cabinet all stars or rock stars, but Caroline Mulroney was delivering in her portfolio. Stephen Lecce has had a very tough portfolio, and he's done a very good job. So I think what you can read into the future on that is, one, that the premier was reelected in part because of his government's track record. He has a great deal of confidence in his team, and he's keeping a lot of that team in place to deliver on the promises of the last election and the budget that led into it.
And we saw Lisa MacLeod and Ross Romano both ousted out of cabinet today. Also, Nina Tangri was not included in the cabinet swearing-in ceremony, but that's because she informed the premier of her intentions to run for Speaker of the Legislature. What do you make of some of the people? Lisa MacLeod's been in cabinet for, I believe, the majority of the tenure that Doug Ford's been in government for. Ross Romano got promoted in the last cabinet shuffle to government and consumer services. So what do you make of specifically those two individuals being ousted out of cabinet?
Look, I mean, in terms of cabinet making, there's a lot of factors that go into play: experience, regional representation, diversity, inclusion of as many perspectives as possible, and also having turnover of ideas. So, it's never the goal of someone to go in and decide who to remove from cabinet. That just doesn't happen. It's about building a team with a more diverse representation, be it regional or other representation. And if you look at Northern Ontario, the Progressive Conservatives picked up a lot of seats there. They had to make room for some of the really impressive, be it the former chair of the Ontario Association of Municipalities who was elected in the region, or in Hamilton East Stony Creek, where the member has been added to cabinet. That's a riding that the Progressive Conservatives hadn't won and haven't really had representation in that city in quite some time. So I think those were the factors. It wasn't, I'd say, an indictment of the performance of those two individuals or satisfaction with them, just of the array of factors that go into cabinet making. Unfortunately, some things have to give.
Okay, Progressive Conservative strategist Michael Diamond. Michael Diamond, thanks so much for your time and for providing your perspective on today's cabinet swearing-in ceremony.
Thanks for having me.
Joining me now is Steve Paikin, anchor and host of The Agenda with Steve Paikin, who's covered Ontario politics over the past number of years, and he was at today's swearing-in ceremony. Steve, thanks so much for making the time. Let's start out with kind of the obvious thing that came out of today's swearing-in ceremony. The majority of cabinet ministers stayed in the same portfolios: Caroline Mulroney in transportation, Peter Bethlenfalvy in finance, and Stephen Lecce in education. All of the big ministers didn't seem to change their portfolios. What does that say as to, I guess, the direction that this government is heading in?
It's always a bit difficult to interpret too much from these things, but obviously the premier had a couple of choices. He could do a kind of a steady as she goes and leave everybody pretty much where they were and maybe tinker with a few portfolios, or he could do a massive overhaul. And obviously he decided he didn't want to do the massive overhaul. He kind of liked where people were. So besides the obvious necessity of finding a new health minister, which he did in Sylvia Jones, who's an MPP from Dufferin-Caledon in the 905. He left most of the big players right where they left off before the election took place.
What about Doug Ford's nephew, Michael Ford, who's become the new Citizenship and Multiculturalism Minister? There's been lots of questions over the course of today, and I'm sure some of those questions will continue over the days and perhaps even weeks to come as to how does he have to prove that, he's there because of his performance based off of the fact that, say, he's Doug Ford's nephew?
Well, it's a really interesting question. And I've been trying to think all day long about whether I can recall any other premier appointing anybody who's in the family to a cabinet job, and I can't think of one. Here's a couple of things I'd say about that, Wyatt. Number one, if Michael Ford is not ready for prime time, we're going to find that out soon enough, in which case his uncle will have not done him any favors at all by promoting him too quickly. If, however, as many people have told me today and in previous days that I've spoken to about this, that Michael Ford actually does have the goods and he's a good politician and he listens and he tries to build bridges among community groups, then he'll do just fine. And Doug Ford should then get the credit for putting somebody in a position at a very young age, 28 years old, to succeed. Michael Ford is not the youngest cabinet minister of all time. There were a couple of other ministers in previous governments who were 27, so a little younger than him. But to be sure, this one is going to raise eyebrows because they share the same last name. I think it's a little unfair to say Michael Ford only got the job because of nepotism, because he's related to the premier. There's no question that played in his favor. But you can also say that the premier wanted to help a guy who won his seat by a very narrow margin. And that's a seat that almost never goes conservative. It's usually a liberal NDP fight. So there's that. Help him with a little profile. He's not exactly just in off the turnip truck. The guy has been an elected person in two other situations, both city council and I guess school board. So, as with all things in politics, Wyatt, we'll see.
And there were some people who stayed in their portfolios today, but they seem to have gained small portions of their title. I'm thinking, say, Monty McNaughton, who's gained the immigration portion to his title. So I guess, what do you make of some of the people who, say, have gained a little bit to their portfolio, or those types of ministers who have been promoted in today's cabinet shuffle?
Well, I would put Kinga Surma in the same camp. She's infrastructure minister, plus with responsibility for selling off government real estate. I guess I'd put Sylvia Jones in the same place, where she's the health minister and the deputy premier. So those are a few other people who have now added responsibilities to what they had before. It says to me that the premier rewards you if you do a good job. If he gains confidence in you, that you know what you're doing, he'll add responsibilities to your plate. There are a bunch of new ministers today, a few anyway, who are in the door. They are at the cabinet table. As one minister told me once upon a time, there are no bad seats at the cabinet table. If you're in that room and at that table, you have an opportunity to have an outsized influence from other people who are not in that room. So this is a chance for those who are experienced to assume more responsibilities, and it's a chance for those with very little experience to show that they've got the right stuff.
And over the course of the day, you've heard various partisan aspects and partisan views on, say, Lisa MacLeod being removed from the cabinet. People in the opposition benches or NDP or Liberal Party supporters say that it's a step in the right direction, and then progressive conservatives basically just attribute it to cabinet making is difficult, and no matter what cabinet is made, there are going to be some challenges in doing so. So I guess, just for a nonpartisan view on that, what do you make of Lisa MacLeod and, say, Ross Romano not being in cabinet? And I guess you could throw Nina Tangri in there, even though she did inform the premier that she is going to run for speaker.
Yeah, I'm going to say something that I'm not sure anybody else is going to say today, which is, it's a really hard thing for a premier or his representative to go to somebody who's been in cabinet and say, I'm taking you out of cabinet, which is a very short form way of saying, I'm kind of ending the career that you thought you had prematurely. While this was a very happy day for most progressive conservatives in Ontario, and certainly for Doug Ford, and certainly for the people who got sworn in today, it was a pretty sad day for three people. And I think we should keep in mind that this is a very human business. And for those three people, this will be, potentially the toughest day of their political lives. I'm sure there are explanations for why these three people were dropped from cabinet today. There were no scrums by any ministers or the premier after the swearing in, Wyatt, so we don't know what those reasons might be. So let's keep in mind that there are human stories attached to what for a lot of people are just moving checkers on a checkerboard. Second thing is this. The last couple of years have been really difficult times for any cabinet ministers, let alone those with tough loads. And, Lisa MacLeod had tourism, sport, cultural industries. It was a very full plate. She had to deal with festivals and festivals as small as something that might attract a couple of hundred people in rural Ontario to the multi-million-dollar budgets of the Art Gallery of Ontario, the Royal Ontario Museum, and for goodness sakes, the Toronto Raptors as well, and the Toronto Maple Leafs, and everything in between. And trying to deal with the myriad concerns that all of these cultural industries would have had was a tough job. Many people I've spoken to over the years thought she brought a lot of passion to it. She advocated well on their behalf. She tried to get them support when COVID shut their businesses down, and these businesses were bleeding millions and millions of dollars. And, at the end of the day, did she have too many fights with the premiers and that's why she was dropped? Or she put out a statement today, as you saw, probably Wyatt, saying that she's dealing with some mental health issues right now that she needs to attend to. And maybe that's why she was dropped from cabinet, so she could attend to her health. I don't think we know the full story on this yet. Maybe it'll come out in the days ahead. But, these are the absolutely excruciating decisions that every premier and his or her team have to make. And I remember talking to Bill Davis about this, and he absolutely hated having to tell people that their political careers, essentially, as they knew them, were over because they were being dropped from cabinet. In fact, Mr. Davis, who was premier from 1971 to 85, disliked doing it so much, he used to have somebody else do it for him because he just thought it was so painful to have to tell these people that bad news. So, yeah, a great day for most Tories, a tough day for a handful.
Okay, Steve Paikin, anchor and host of The Agenda with Steve Paikin. Steve, as always, thanks for your time and obviously for providing your interesting perspectives on the cabinet that was unveiled by the premier today.
Not at all, White. Good to see you again.
Yeah.